Okay, we are today we're going to talk about stimulants, uppers, as they say in the front of your book, the title of your book. We're only going to cover about half the chapter because it's such a long chapter. So we'll cover half the chapter to this week and then half the chapter next week. In 2008, 5.6 million Americans used cocaine or cocaine products. 1.4 million Americans used methamphetamines for non-medicinal purposes. That may have reversed itself from 2008. Cocaine is more expensive. It doesn't have as long an impact on the individual, so this may have reversed itself. I tried to look this up before I did the lecture, but I couldn't find anything. 83 million Americans used tobacco products in 2008, including this little boy. 166 million Americans drank coffee last year, mostly daily. Americans averaged 56 gallons of soft drinks per person in 2008. Most of the soft drinks were caffeinated. That's 598 12-ounce cans of drink, or 359 20-ounce bottles of pop. If we look at the picture to the left, the only thing that doesn't have caffeine in it, I don't think root beer has caffeine in it, but ginger ale doesn't, 7-Up doesn't, and Sprite doesn't. All the rest of them do. Not this one, whatever that one is. Not sure what that one is. Anyway, the Coke products, Dr. Pepper does, and all the Pepsi products do. That's a lot. Well, 598, that's almost 2 cans of pop a day. In 2008, 200 million people used betel nuts. They brew it and they drank it like coffee, or they chewed it. And when you chew betel nuts, as we're going to see later, it's very dark red. And if you chew enough of it, it will turn your teeth black. Always attractive. In Southeast Asia, especially Thailand, the area is having a severe problem with a form of methamphetamine called yaba. In the area around the Horn of Africa, the majority of the male population and much of the female population chew khat, a mild stimulant. 1.3 million people worldwide smoke cigarettes. Natural stimulants include cocaine, which comes from the coca shrub, nicotine, which comes from the tobacco plant, cathinone, which comes from the khat bush, ephedrine, which comes from the ephedra bush, aerocholine, which comes from betel nut, and caffeine, which comes from the coffee plant. So all the caffeine that you consume in your pop comes from coffee. It's caffeine that's synthesized from the coffee. Synthesized stimulants, methamphetamines, diet pills, methylphenidate, which is the chemical name for Ritalin, and methcathinone. Stimulants increase the activity in the central nervous system. It boosts your energy. It raises your heart rate and blood pressure. It increases respiration. It reduces appetite, and it subdues your thirst. They may make the user more alert. Stimulants may make the user more alert, more active, more confident, more anxious, more restless, more aggressive. Stimulants are used to treat narcolepsy, obesity, and ADHD. Narcolepsy is the condition where the individual falls asleep when they become excited, as weird as that may sound. Stimulants work by affecting 4 neurotransmitters, epinephrine, serotonin, and dopamine increase your energy, and norepinephrine increases confidence, feelings of well-being, and motivation. And this has a lot to do with why these individuals tend to get into trouble, because of the norepinephrine. They feel like they can do no wrong. Most of the neurons affected by epinephrine and norepinephrine are located in an area of the midbrain called the locus ceruleus. This portion of the brain networks with many parts of the rest of the brain. When the body needs an extra jolt of energy, epinephrine and norepinephrine are released to provide the energy. When the individual takes uppers, it forces the release of the energy chemicals. These drugs cause the body to react to stress that doesn't exist and makes the individual more talkative, more hyperactive, and more hypervigilant, kind of like Don Knotts' character Barney Fife in the Andy Griffith Show. Andy of Mayberry. The stronger the stimulant, the longer it takes the body to recover. Large quantities over long periods of time deplete the body's energy stores and leaves the body without reserves. Withdrawal from stimulants can create severe depression that can last for days, weeks, or months, depending on which drug you're taking and how long you've used it and how much you've used. People tend to build a fairly rapid tolerance to the stimulant, forcing the individual to consume more and more of the substance. Even coffee will require more and more with increased consumption. The reward reinforcement pathway is a natural structure that informs the individual of an activity or substance that supports survival. It tells you when you're not hungry anymore. It tells you when you're not thirsty anymore. It tells you when you have been satiated as far as your sexual desires are concerned. When a strong stimulant is used, it overstimulates the reward reinforcement pathway and the body doesn't respond to hunger, thirst, or sexual activity. The brain cannot be satisfied. So you're not hungry, you're not thirsty, and you have a unsatiated sexual appetite. As more and more of the stimulant is used, tolerance builds and the rush and stimulation diminishes. But what does remain is the emotional memory of the effects of the stimulant. This is accomplished by the dopamine stimulation in the reward reinforcement pathway. One of the side effects of long-term stimulant usage can be dehydration and malnourishment. And we're going to see some of the effects of this in just a second. The hypothalamus regulates thirst and hunger. Stimulants fool this part of the brain to think that the individual is neither hungry or thirsty. This can lead to deficiencies of vitamins and minerals as well as damage to the teeth. It also, when it talks about thirst, one of the things that happens to individuals when they're taking stimulants is that they don't drink enough. And since they don't drink enough, they don't hydrate their skin enough. And since they're not hydrating their skin gets dry and it gets itchy. And then they get, they think they have bugs crawling all over their skin. So individuals who use methamphetamines or snort a lot of cocaine, what they'll do is they'll shave all the hair off their bodies. And this is because their skin is dry. When the stimulant is making their skin dry, and the fact that they're not drinking enough fluids to hydrate their bodies enough makes them feel like they have things crawling all over them, as weird as that is. And we'll see what happens. Stimulants, including the weaker ones like nicotine and caffeine, induce vascular spasms and constrict blood flow to organs and tissue. Heavy smokers will have a pasty complexion due to the restricted blood flow. This restricted blood flow can slow tissue repair and the healing process. Chronic use of stimulants will weaken blood vessels, increasing the risk of stroke. So if you have an individual who has injured themselves, they have a wound on their arm, and they are a smoker, the reality is that it's going to take them longer to heal than a person who doesn't smoke. One of the other things about when we're talking about stroke, nicotine is not just a vasoconstrictor, it also makes the platelets sticky. So they are more likely to stick together. Since they are more likely to stick together, then they are more likely to cause a blood clot. And of course, if this happens too frequently, then it can cause a stroke. It can also cause mini strokes, ischemia, where they have small blood clots in their brain. And of course, this can cause momentary lapses of memory and whatnot. But at least the stimulant user has increased confidence and stimulated feelings of euphoria. They will be talkative, but they'll also be restless, irritable. They will have a difficult time falling asleep. They may be paranoid. They may be aggressive, and they may become violent. Prolonged use of high doses of methamphetamine can lead to a clinical level of paranoia or kick the individual into psychosis. Meth increases the dopamine in the central nervous system. One of the conditions of schizophrenia is an overabundance of dopamine receptor sites. Sometimes the meth user will drift into permanent schizophrenia. I've told you the story of or maybe I haven't told you the story, of a student that I had at Fort Belknap. She was part Grovon and part Aleut. Her mother was Alaskan. She was an Alaskan native. Interesting lady. When she took crystal meth, she would have hallucinations, and she did some really interesting things. One thing that she did was forge checks. The other thing that she did, eventually, she became psychotic when she used crystal meth. And this one time, her father had just died, and they were at his funeral, and she had to go to Great Falls. Every time she went to Great Falls, she felt like she had to use, because that's where she used. When she was living in Great Falls, she was a meth head, and so she had to go down to Great Falls for the funeral. And while she was there, of course, she used, and she started having a psychotic episode. And what happened to her was that she thought she was Hispanic, and she started speaking Spanish, which she doesn't actually speak. So it sounded like Spanish, but it wasn't really Spanish. It was just gibberish. She also claimed that her father had murdered her mother. Now, the weird part about that was her father had just died, and her mother was still alive. So here she went to the police, and she told them that her father had murdered her mother and buried her in the backyard of this one house. And so they went and they dug up the backyard looking for this lady's body. And as it turned out, of course, there was no body there. And eventually she came out of her psychosis. She was no longer this lady. But the next time she used, she became that lady again. And I warned her that if eventually this was going to become permanent, that she was not going to know who she was. She was going to think that she was a Hispanic girl, Hispanic female individual, and she would never come back again. And of course, I'm not exactly sure what happened, because I moved away from there in 2011, but I'm hoping she stayed away from meth. Nicotine provides almost immediate tolerance. All stimulants in the slower but similar manner develop tolerance rapidly. Dependence is developed with tolerance, since the need becomes greater and greater. Nicotine has the strongest dependence level, as we've already learned. It kicks the individual into addiction the fastest of all the drugs. Cocaine is synthesized from the coca leaf. Since its introduction in South America with the invasion of the Incas in Peru, it has enjoyed epidemics and lag periods. The first epidemic was at the end of the 19th century. The famous author Robert Louis Stevenson wrote the novel The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in 6 days, taking cocaine as a treatment for tuberculosis. Many have speculated that the two personalities represented in the novel actually represented Stevenson on and off the stimulant. Stevenson may have written the novel to explain to his friends his change of personality. Sorry, my dog needed to go out. Cocaine won't grow just anywhere like marijuana. Cocaine grows in the moderately high slopes of the Andes Mountains. Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, Colombia, some of the islands of Java and Indonesia. These are the only places where the coca shrub will grow. Coca leaves don't contain very much alkaloid cocaine. 1 acre of 6 to 8 foot bushes will only produce 1.5 to 2 kilograms or 3 to 4.5 pounds of cocaine. Cocaine refinement begins with stage 1, soaking the leaves in alkali and water. That's the first stage. The second stage is cocaine refinement. This is where the workers add gasoline, acetone, or kerosene to create a paste. Why do we put these things in there? These will break down the cellulose. It will break it down into, it'll release the alkaloid substance in there, and the alkaloid substance is what becomes the cocaine. Stage 3 involves discarding the waste leaves and adding an acid, either hydrochloric or sulfuric acid. In stage 4, the cocaine paste is mixed with lime and ammonia. The last stage is separating the cocaine hydrochloride from the paste, and then we have the powder. Smuggling cocaine into the United States has been a constant cat and mouse game between the smugglers and the DEA since the 1970s. During the Reagan administration, a friend of the president's was killed by smugglers to steal his yacht, and since then, the military has been used to stop mass shipments coming in by plane and ship from South America. When I was in the service, I was stationed at Tinker Air Force Base in Oklahoma City. A number of my students, a number of my Hispanic students who could speak Spanish, were transported down to South America, where they could intercept radio messages from smugglers, from the cartels, and that was their job. I just looked at a postcard sent to me by one of these individuals, one of my students. I was teaching at Langston University at the time, and a lot of these individuals were my students. And he sent me a postcard from South America. He had been on a raid down there, and they went into the lab in the middle of the jungle, and they burned it, of course. But he said one of the problems was that they didn't give them very good weapons, and here they were faced off with all these guards who were carrying machine guns, and they were carrying shotguns and whatnot. But of course they ran away. They were criminals, and the military had their mission, had a correct mission, so that they were, even though they were outgunned, they were able to subdue the guards. Actually, they just chased them away, and then they burned the lab. Today, there is only one sure route into the United States, and that is along the porous border with Mexico. Colombian drug cartels smuggle about 2/3 of their produce in this manner. The last third continues to come over by sea. North America consumes 40 to 50% of the world's cocaine. This is a really serious problem. If you care about this stuff, maybe you've been watching what's going on. A lot of times they'll dig tunnels under the border, and they will have trains that transport their drugs from the Mexican side to the American side. So they just dig these tunnels like people escaping from a prisoner of war camp or something. It is estimated that Americans spent $36.1 billion on cocaine in 2004. I just looked this up before class, before I started this lecture. In 2019, the figure was $150 billion. So we spend a lot of money on cocaine. Cocaine in the United States averages 84% purity, with prices ranging from $12,000 to $35,000 per kilogram. That's about 2.2 pounds. Most people don't buy it by the pound, of course. They buy it by the ounce. or the gram. This is a gram. There are 1,000 grams in a kilogram. The street value of 1 gram of cocaine is between $50 and $200, with an average purity of 57%, because they cut it. That way they can make more profit. Crack cocaine comes in rocks from 1/10 of a gram to 1/2 a gram, and sell for $10 to $20 each rock. Hardcore cocaine users will spend an average of $186 per week on cocaine. Cocaine is actually cheaper than it ever has been, thank goodness. It is estimated that there are probably over 3 million hardcore cocaine users in the United States. The man on the left, this is Billy Mays. He OD'd on cocaine at age 51. I was just watching a video of his son. He had just made a flight from Los Angeles to Tampa. He was from Tampa, and of course he was the first guy that pitched OxyClean and Kaboom and all of these other things. He was a loudmouth, is what he was. He talked really loud, kind of yelled at you. Anyway, he died at age 51. It's a big surprise to everybody. He'd just come into Tampa from Los Angeles. When his plane was landing, it had a blowout. One of the tires blew out, and it went screeching off the runway. And of course, he was kind of shaken. He called his son, and of course, his son was a little bit upset. I guess Billy Mays had his hip replaced a couple times, and it didn't quite take. And he was on his third surgery the next day, but he didn't make it. He snorted too much cocaine and died at age 51. When the Spanish first arrived in South America, they found many people in the Andes Mountains chewing coca leaves. This is the Inca Highway. It's a walking path. It was created by the Inca 600 years ago or 700 years ago. It's a really old pathway. Anyway, while I was in Peru, we walked part of the Inca Highway. It goes up and down the mountains. Of course, they didn't have any means of transportation. If you understand what South America was before Europeans got here, they had no beasts of burden. Llamas can't carry very much. So people did most of the carrying, and these are porters, of course. This is what they look like. And they walked on the Inca Highway, these rocks. Most Incan users actually mix the juice with lime from ground shell or ash to accelerate the introduction of the alkaloid into the brain. Introduction occurs in about 3 to 5 minutes. When we were in Peru, they actually were selling coca leaves on the streets of Lima or Cuzco, wherever we happened to be. And some of the people in my group, I was on a Fulbright trip. Some of the individuals in my group actually bought some coca leaves, and they tried to make it work. They didn't understand that they needed to put baking soda in with the coca leaves. I guess it doesn't taste very good. They also made a coca tea, which was theoretically made you able to withstand the high elevations. We were up about 8,000–9,000 feet. I didn't do that. There were a bunch of people that did try it, and it really didn't work for them. I didn't do it, and there was a friend of mine. He was a softball player. We were both softball players, and we vowed that we weren't going to do any of that kind of stuff while we were down there. And of course, we're running circles around everybody else. This is in 2003. I was a pup back then. I was in my 50s, so here I was running around all these 30 and 40-year-old academics. Couldn't handle it. The conquistadores encouraged use of coca and increased the productivity of their Quichua workers. In 1859, Albert Newman isolated the active ingredient in coca leaves, cocaine hydrochloride. He isolated the substance was 200 times more powerful by weight than the coca leaf. The drug was first used as an anesthetic and as a medicine to treat depression, tuberculosis, gastric disorder, and asthma. It was actually used by Sigmund Freud. And Sigmund Freud becoming a cocaine addict is a favorite story of a lot of his detractors. The reality was he didn't use cocaine for a very long period of time, and eventually, of course, after a relatively short period of time, he stopped using cocaine. He was able to get off the white horse or whatever. Cocaine wine was popular in France and Italy in the late 1860s. This ushered in the most modern cocaine epidemic, as 2 glasses of wine delivered the same amount of cocaine as a line of coke. It took 15 to 30 minutes for the cocaine to take effect after ingesting it in this manner. And so maltine, of course, is coca wine. Look, it's awarded 10 gold medals. Maltine. By the 1880s, patented medicines and drinks began to appear laced with cocaine, opium, morphine, heroin, cannabis, and alcohol. Since no one really understood addiction or the real power of the supplements and their tonics, many people became addicted. Most of these individuals were women because they were selling these patented medicines to women. Men would just go to the bars and get drunk. The women, of course, they didn't feel like they could drink. They could drink alcohol like the men did, so they had these patented medicines with all these secret ingredients and whatnot. People began introducing cocaine into their systems in new ways. Injecting intravenously introduces the drug into the system in 30 seconds. Snorting cocaine introduces the substance into the blood in 2 to 5 minutes. Snorting more cocaine is counterproductive, as the drug is a vasoconstrictor. So once introduced into the nasal passage, it slows the absorption of any new cocaine. In other words, the blood vessels become so small that you're not getting any into your system. As the cocaine wears off, the nasal passage opens back up, causing a runny and sniffling nose. It can also cause hemorrhaging. And of course, I've seen this many, many times. People would come into the emergency room with a bloody nose. The reason they had a bloody nose is because they'd been snorting cocaine. The cocaine had broken their blood vessel, and now that the cocaine had worn off, the vasoconstriction of the cocaine had worn off, now they were bleeding and we couldn't get it stopped. So usually what we did, we would try to get it stopped in all the little tricks that we knew. We'd stuff it with cotton. We would put ice on it. We made them hold their nose back, or their heads back. We would force them to relax and make them lie down. You don't want to swallow too much blood. It's toxic and it can make you sick. So one of the things that we did, one of the things we would have to do eventually, if we couldn't get it to stop, we'd have to cauterize the blood vessels in their nose. And you do that by burning it. That's what cauterizing means. It means to burn. So we'd have to do that. We'd have to put a laser up their nose and burn it. Smoking, cocaine-laced cigarettes were introduced in 1914, but the high temperature of the cigarette destroyed most of the psychoactive substance, so it didn't really work. Because cocaine is a natural substance, it tends to be metabolized very quickly, and its effects dissipate much faster than synthetic stimulants. The half-life of cocaine is 30 to 90 minutes and is detectable in the urine for up to 36 hours after ingestion. Cocaine is used as a topical anesthetic because of its powerful vasoconstriction capabilities. Since cocaine receptors are found in the smooth muscles of the lungs, cocaine use will cause the bronchi to dilate. Synthetic cocaine products mimic the effects of cocaine for eye, dental, and cutaneous surgeries. Lidocaine, procaine, xylocaine, and novocaine are all cocaine byproducts. Cocaine excites the user by blocking the reuptake of the neurotransmitters acetylcholine, dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine. The abundance of these neurotransmitters gives the individual a feeling of well-being, mastery, omnipotence, euphoria, and general excitement. And of course, most of that is due to the increased amount of norepinephrine in your system. Cocaine metabolizes fairly rapidly, leaving the 4 neurotransmitters vulnerable to reuptake when the cocaine is gone. Cocaine's positive effects disappear fairly suddenly after 5 or 10 minutes. This absence of the previous feelings is referred to as the crash and may last for hours, days, or even weeks. Cocaine overstimulates the release of dopamine. If this occurs over time, it triggers the fright center in the brain, causing paranoia. Cocaine also overstimulates the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine. If this occurs over time, the individual may suffer from lethargy, low blood pressure, and anhedonia, the inability to feel pleasure. Cocaine causes the overstimulation of serotonin, which not only makes the individual happy, but increases sexual activity as well. If this continues to happen over time, the individual may suffer from insomnia, agitation, and severe emotional depression. Cocaine blocks the metabolism of acetylcholine, increasing alertness, memory, and aggression. If overstimulation occurs over time, the person may suffer from tremors, memory lapses, mental confusion, and possibly hallucinations. Some people actually use cocaine as an aphrodisiac, since at low doses it enhances sexual desire and prolongs ejaculation. However, in some cases it causes spontaneous ejaculation. In higher doses and with chronic use, cocaine may cause erectile dysfunction and a disinterest in sex. The lack of sexual need may lead to high-risk sexual behavior and unusual sexual practices, since sexual need no longer exists for the individual. So they will start doing really strange things, having sex with people they probably should leave alone. Raping, or violence. Remember, violence becomes part of this individual's personality. We can put all these scenarios together. There's really no reason to. You just need to know that it can cause some really strange sexual situations. For cocaine users who are prone to violence, cocaine makes them more aggressive and violent because inhibitory functions are suppressed and the cingulate gyrus in the temporal lobes. Emotional triggers are overstimulated in the amygdala. The fright center is hyperactivated in the limbic system, so they become more violent and paranoid. Not a good combination. When cocaine is combined with alcohol, the result is a substance called cocaethylene, which causes increased agitation, euphoria, and violence. In one study of domestic violence, all the perpetrators had used alcohol on the day of the violence, and 67% had used cocaine with the alcohol. Cocaethylene is also more likely to induce heart conduction anomalies that may lead to a heart attack. This substance has a half-life 3 times that of cocaine, and therefore can cause prolonged high blood pressure. While the brain gains feelings of euphoria and well-being from the cocaine, the heart is being abused by the substance. Cocaine causes the heart rate to increase and the blood vessels to constrict, raising blood pressure 20 to 30 units. Small muscle repair stops during use. The stress on the heart and the muscle damage being done by its use can cause damage to the heart muscle, coronary arteries, and other blood vessels of the heart. Prolonged high blood pressure weakens blood vessel walls in the brain, leading to stroke. Cocaine also causes a curious condition where calcium and fat deposits collect in blood vessels, causing heart attacks or strokes. Cocaine crosses the placental barrier, meaning that when mom uses, her fetus uses also within seconds. Damage is done to the fetus's blood vessel in a similar reaction to that of the mother, and may result in miscarriage, stroke, placental separation, and later on, after the baby is born, SIDS. One study looking at 717 babies born to cocaine-using mothers found that they were born on an average 1.2 weeks early, 1.2 pounds lighter, 1 inch shorter, a head that is 3/4 of an inch smaller in circumference. The babies are born agitated, irritable, with high blood pressure. The baby is usually malnourished because that is the lifestyle of the cocaine and amphetamine users. Escaping from the cocaine-soaked placental environment does not remove the child from danger. Stimulant users are often inattentive and uncaring about the needs of others, and this includes their infants, which results in emotional deprivation for the child, neglect of the child, and bonding problems. Studies show that rates of mental delays are double among stimulant-exposed children. All is not bleak. With concentrated postnatal care, these infants can catch up with their peers by toddlerhood. Tolerance of the euphoric effect begins with the first usage of cocaine. Increased usage has been seen of 25 times the level within days. This is due to the adaptation of the brain to dopamine stimulation in the nucleus accumbens. Tolerance is to the euphoric effect only, since paranoia increases, as does cardiovascular effects. Withdrawal from cocaine use is very real, despite the misperceptions of researchers into the 1990s. All the crash symptoms become accentuated and prolonged depending on the dosage used, frequency of use, and the length of use. Anhedonia, as we said before, they can find no pleasure. Lack of energy, emotional depression, loss of motivation, anxiety, vivid and unpleasant dreams, insomnia, increased appetite, psychomotor agitation, intense craving for the drug. Cycle of quitting and relapse of stimulants. After a binge session with the drug, the individual crashes, sleeps for a prolonged period, awakens with renewed energy, and swears off the drug forever. The individual feels better for a few days and begins to feel as they did before they began using the drug. 7 to 10 days after quitting, the craving starts to build, energy level drops, emotional depression sets in, as they can find no pleasure in their surroundings. After a couple of weeks or a month, they relapse, not being able to deal with the depression or the ever-increasing craving. While cocaine overdoses are common because of the rapid metabolization, the effects are rarely fatal. In large city emergency rooms in 2004, 41% of visits were due to cocaine usage, most because the individual felt as if they were dying. And usually that dying has to do with feeling like you're having a heart attack. The U.S. averages, and of course, since their blood pressure is so high, they have to be treated, and they have to be treated as if they might have a heart attack. And that's one of the basic problems of dealing with somebody who's a cocaine user. You can't just go, oh, he's just on cocaine, and let him go home. It doesn't work that way. What you have to do is you have to treat them as if they're about to have a heart attack, because that's usually what kills a cocaine addict, is the fact that they have a heart attack. So you have to treat them. The U.S. averages between 2,000 to 3,000 stimulant deaths every year, either from the initial stimulatory stage that causes seizures, hypertension, hyperthermia, stroke, or tachycardia, or later with the depression stage from extreme respiratory depression and coma. Some people will experience inverse tolerance, where they become more sensitive to cocaine's effects. Now for some ugly pictures. Long-term cocaine or amphetamine usage may lead to tactile hallucinations called formications. The sensation that tiny bugs are crawling on the user's skin. Remember what I said before. One of the problems is you don't know when you're thirsty, so you do not hydrate. You're not hydrating your skin, so your skin becomes dry and it feels like you've got bugs crawling all over your skin. So because of that, these people, you'll see them, they're always scratching, they're always picking at their skin. And of course, this can cause all kinds of interesting problems. It can cause open sores. The open sores become infected. and the individual gets impetigo or some other horrible skin disease. This is the kind of stuff that we see with people who are stimulant users, abusers. The user will sometimes scratch themselves bloody trying to rid themselves of the imaginary pests, and this is known as formication. Cocaine and amphetamine usage may also cause dental problems for the user. This is usually caused from poor nutrition, poor dental hygiene, and the acidic effects of the drug. The individual also tends to suffer dehydration that causes the gums to recede, and that is always attractive, having these people come into your emergency room. They've got the worst breath you can possibly imagine. Seizures are sometimes caused by excessive cocaine or amphetamine usage. 2 to 10% of cocaine users will have seizures, 3 times more women than men. Cocaine and amphetamine users can sometimes suffer from gastrointestinal problems, gastric ulcers, retroperitoneal fibrosis, visceral infarction, intestinal ischemia, gastrointestinal tract perforation, colonic ischemia, which means that the ischemia means stroke, means something has clotted, some blood vessel is clotted off. Visceral infarction means death, so that means that portions of your intestines are dying. Retroperitoneal fibrosis, your peritoneal area is down around your anus. You get lumps down in that area. Gastric ulcers, of course, have to do with ulcers, abscesses in your stomach, in your duodenum. Gastrointestinal tract perforation, usually it's from the ulcers. Oh, what a mess. What a great mess. Another possible side effect of cocaine usage comes from dopamine changes in the cerebellum from cocaine or amphetamine toxicity. The individual suffers from involuntary writhing, flailing, jerking, or sinuous movements of the arms and legs. This is sometimes referred to as meth or crack dancing. I'm going to show you a film right now. We're not going to watch the whole thing, but I want you to watch this guy. It's like Judge Judy. There's a lady and her ex-boyfriend, and I don't know what she's trying to get out of him, but you need to watch his movements. Here we go.
What we have is a claim by the plaintiff that the defendant is obligated to her for failure to pay back rentals, utilities, and also for the cost of a, DNA paternity test that the two of them engaged in. Apparently, the two of them have taken the test and directed that it be furnished to me for my inspection with whomever. Well, in other words, if he's not the father, then she pays. If he is the father, she gets paid.
You'll be paying.
That's good. That's good.
Don't get in here.
That ain't bad.
Don't get in here. Show out.
Well, yes,
I'm not going to try to report on.
Well, just chill just a little
Yes, sir.
bit. Right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir, Your Honor. Judge Joe Brown.
You know how to act better.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I ain't trying to show out.
Stop. Would you stop?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Okay, I'll try not.
Can you hold still, or are you under the influence?
Under the influence. Hey. Under the influence. Not right now. Under the influence. But that woman now, she done drove me down influence on a lot of things that I said I never do. He gonna lie. How can I? When it's the truth. God knows. Oh, God.
I wouldn't bring him into it.
You please.
Man, how would you take care of him if officially you're unemployed?
I wasn't unemployed then. You were unemployed. I wasn't unemployed then. Yes, you were. But I was selling. No, excuse me, Your Honor. He was doing that. But he was receiving his daughter's Social Security check for her mother's death. And he wasn't giving me none like that.
Excuse me. Were you let him go. Let him tell you the truth. Let him tell you the truth.
Okay, just
let him go. I have a purpose. You're showing a classic example. All that kinetic movement from having too much energy.
I'm sorry, but it's just hard on me when someone
showing the residual effects from. So you've already said that you were moving merchandise.
I'm not lying. I'm not denying. I'm not. I'm here to tell the truth. Not, didn't I say? Didn't I raise my right hand? I don't care who hear the truth. The only one can condemn me is God. But Your Honor,
you may get a little remark. He worketh in mysterious ways.
Don't he? Don't he?
Yes.
He does. He works through you right now. Whatever you decide.
You've candidly admitted that you've been moving merchandise.
Oh, hey, Arkansas know it. Who don't know it?
Okay, there you go. You noticed he couldn't stand still. He had all that kinetic energy, as Judge Joe Brown was saying. That's crack dancing, what they call crack dancing. They can't hold still. Stimulant-induced psychosis is impossible to differentiate from organic psychosis. Psychotic symptoms may disappear with abstinence, but it may take hours, days, or even months. 1/3 to 1/2 of chronic cocaine users will develop mild transient paranoia. With repeated use after a psychotic episode, smaller and smaller doses will trigger psychotic episodes. Polydrug use is very common among cocaine users because the individual may need chemical assistance to come down off their stimulation. The most common drug used with cocaine are alcohol, heroin, sedative hypnotics, and nicotine. A person who smokes cigarettes is 22 times more likely to use cocaine than a non-smoker. While the purity of cocaine coming into the country averages 80 to 90%, most marketed cocaine has been cut with substances to increase profits. As we said before, the average is about 57% pure. What do they cut it with? They cut it with baby laxatives, lactose, vitamin B, aspirin, mannitol, sugar, tetracaine, and procaine. Injecting any drug is dangerous, but injecting street drugs is especially so. The user can never be sure of the purity of the drug. The drug may be contaminated with dangerous substances that are not meant to be introduced into the human body. Bacteria and viruses may be introduced. 50 to 90% of IV drug users are infected with hepatitis C from using contaminated needles. And the friend I was telling you about, she suffers from hepatitis C. The reason she suffers from hepatitis C is because she was always, and she told me, she was always quite fastidious about her needles. She was able to get them from a friend who was diabetic, so she always had a clean needle. She always hid her needles. Well, one night, and of course this happens with people that use drugs. They let people stay with them all the time. I mean, their home is like a crash pad for all their druggy friends and whatnot. Anyway, she had a friend that she allowed to stay with her. She had to go to work. She went to work. When she came home, the girl was gone, and so was her stash. But her needle was still there. Well, what had happened during the night, she had found her stash. She'd shot up with her needle, and then she left it. She left the needle there, but she took the stash. So the next time she used, instead of cleaning her needle, she used the same needle that young lady had used, and as it turned out, she had hepatitis C, and now she has hepatitis C, which is really kind of tragic. Manufacturers and refiners of cocaine had known that in the paste or freebase state, cocaine could be smoked without destroying the euphoric properties. When freebase is mixed with marijuana and smoked it is referred to as bazooka, basuco, or pasta. This form of ingestion gives the user a more intense and immediate effect than snorting. So if you have a freebase paste, you need to burn it, and the way they usually burn it is with an accelerant. Gasoline doesn't work because it has too strong an odor, but they use ether. Ether is, anyway, they freebase with ether. Now the problem with ether is that it's a liquid, but it's also a vapor. but it's a heavy vapor. So if you take a bottle of ether and you pour it on the table, if you poured anything else with a vapor in it, it would rise. The vapor would rise off the table. But ether doesn't do that. Its vapor is heavy. So if you poured it on the table, the liquid would run off, and so would the vapor. The vapor would go to the lowest point. It's a very heavy vapor. Now this can be a problem because you get an accumulation, whereas vapor just dissipates and it's gone. Ether doesn't do that. Ether will accumulate in the lowest point. Now this can be a problem. Okay, so once upon a time there was a singer by the name of Ricky Nelson. He had he had been on the Ozzie and Harriet show. His mother and father were Ozzie and Harriet. He became a famous singer. He was flying somewhere. He had a new girlfriend. His girlfriend, there were a bunch of people in the plane, and the girlfriend was freebasing with ether, and she spilled it. And of course, one of the things you do with ether is you have to light it with some kind of a fire. So she lit it with a cigarette lighter, and it caught the ether on fire. And unfortunately, she had spilled the ether, and the ether was running down to the back of the plane. And so when she lit the freebase, it also lit the ether, which was on the floor. The flames went all the way back to the back of the plane, and the plane blew up, killing everybody on board. And that's how Ricky Nelson died. He died because his girlfriend was freebasing and she spilled her ether, and the ether caught on fire and it blew the plane up. Crack or freebase has 4 properties that make it a sought commodity. The melting point is higher at 195 degrees rather than 98 degrees as compared to the powder. It reaches the brain faster when it's smoked. This form is more readily absorbed by the fat cells in the brain, giving it a more intense reaction. Higher doses of cocaine can be ingested in a shorter period of time. Somebody else who used cocaine, who was a freebaser, was, oh no, I can't think of his name. He was a comedian. Richard Pryor. Richard Pryor was freebasing one day with ether once again. Now remember, ether is heavy, and it doesn't really dissipate with air in the air. He sucked that stuff down his throat, the ether, and when he lit the freebase, it also lit the ether that was down in his throat. It burned him all the way down into his lungs because ether doesn't dissipate with air. And so here he is. He's running out of his house, and he's breathing fire. They caught him, and they made him close his mouth, and eventually, the fire went out. The fire went out because it wasn't getting any oxygen. They took him to the hospital. Everybody thought he was going to die. He didn't die. And Richard Pryor has since died. But he survived to tell more jokes and to be funny again. So you can actually see him after his freebasing incident. It burned off all the skin on his face. And when it did that, he didn't look black. He was an African American comedian. He didn't look black anymore. All the melanin was gone from his face. Eventually, the melanin came back to some extent, but he was never as dark as he was before he had the freebasing accident, as weird as that is. Okay, what are we talking about? We're talking about freebase. This form is more readily absorbed by the fat cells in the brain, giving it a more intense reaction. Higher doses of cocaine can be ingested in a shorter period of time. Any smoked cocaine product will produce a more intense effect than snorted cocaine. This is true even though most of the cocaine products the product is lost in the air, 75% in a pipe and 50% in a cigarette. Hence, more cocaine has to be smoked to get a strong effect. Even when cocaine is smoked or injected, the drug is metabolized rapidly in about 15 to 20 minutes and must be renewed to get a strong effect. Crack gives a rush that only lasts a few seconds and euphoria and excitation that only lasts a few minutes, 5 to 20 minutes. As soon as the effect dissipates, the individual feels irritable, dysphoric, and anxious. For this reason, crack is almost always smoked in a binge pattern. Crack does have some fairly unpleasant side effects. Makes you thirsty, makes you cough, gives you tremors. It dries out your skin, as we said before. It slurs your speech, it blurs your vision. You get what they call crack keratitis, the abrasion of the eye, because crack pipes tend to be relatively short. And when you light them with your cigarette lighter, it can burn your eye. Cracked thumb or hands, burns on the hands and callus on the thumb from lighting a crack pipe. Crack burns, facial burns from lighting the pipe. Once again, like I said, it's a really short pipe. And so here these people are lighting this thing right up next to their faces. Psychological side effects of smoking crack: paranoia, craving for the drug, asocial behavior, attention problems, irritability, drug dreams, hyperexcitability, visual and auditory hallucinations, depression, cocaine psychosis, high-risk sexual behavior. Respiratory side effects from smoking crack: chest pains, pneumonia, coughs, cracked lung, decreased ability to diffuse CO2, which can lead to COPD, hemorrhage, respiratory failure, death due to anesthetization of the respiratory center in the medulla. Crack or freebase can be mixed with marijuana to create what they refer to as caviar, champagne, Grimmies, Fry Daddies, Cocoa Puffs, Hubba, or Woolies. Users may combine crack with PCP or ketamine to make space basing, whack, or tragic magic. Mixing crack with tar heroin creates speedball, hot rocks, or Belushi rocks. That's how John Belushi died, was by mixing crack and cocaine and heroin, and it killed him. When crack or cocaine is mixed with wine, it is called crack coolers. In 2004, 4,500 deaths occurred from the direct or indirect effects of cocaine. Cocaine overdose doesn't always kill, but it results in tachycardia and hyperventilation, accompanied by a feeling of impending death. Death usually results from cardiac arrest, seizure, stroke, respiratory failure, or hyperthermia. Social consequences: because using crack can lead to risky sexual behavior, children are sometimes produced in circumstances that are not optimum. Crack smokers have social problems, and they don't relate to their own offspring any better. Crack smokers show high rates of neglect, abandonment, and the abuse of their children. There are high rates of single and no-parent families. Women willing to trade sex for crack are very common, and then it starts all over again. When I first got here, I was talking to somebody, a policeman, who was from Pinyon. And I guess Pinyon had a real serious crystal meth problem. It may still have a real serious crystal meth problem. Anyway, he was talking about what some women would do. Of course, they would sell themselves for the crack, but he said some women have been caught trying to sell their children for sex so that they could get their next hit of meth, as sick as that is. I had a friend, I had a student when I was at Fort Belknap, teaching at Fort Belknap. And she had a sister that had two children. One of them was 18 months old, and the other was 3 years old. And she had a crack party at her house. And during the crack party, someone raped both of her children. The party lasted for like 3 or 4 days, and by the time it was over with, a lot of people had been rolling in and out of that place, but her children had been molested. And of course, they hadn't and they also hadn't eaten because these people didn't really worry about food. They hadn't eaten in 3 or 4 days, so they took the kids away from her. But of course, you know how mothers are. She was sure her little girl wouldn't do anything like that to hurt her babies. So her mother, they gave them to her mother, the kids to the mother, and then the mother, of course, gave them right back to the daughter. And doggone it if the same thing didn't happen again, like a couple of weeks later. Anyway, eventually they took the kids away from her, even though she was the biological mother. She was certainly not a very good mother. Anyway, and it's really tragic because both of those kids had no clue what was going on. The little girl was only 18 months old. The little boy was 3 months old. And both of them had been molested any number of times. And they weren't exactly sure. They couldn't get any good information from either of the kids, but it was fairly obvious what was going on. So eventually they not only had to take the kids away from the biological mother, but they also had to take it away from the grandparents. And they eventually gave the child, they tried to give it to one of her sisters, but of course her sister had been at the crack party too. Eventually they had to adopt the kids away from the family, as sad as that is. The physical and mental effects of cocaine and amphetamines are similar. Cocaine is about twice as expensive. Cocaine gives a greater rush and more intense high than amphetamines, but amphetamines allow for more prolonged energy. Amphetamines' effect lasts for 6 to 9 times longer than cocaine. Amphetamines are more likely to cause addiction. Amphetamines are synthetic stimulants that provide similar effects as cocaine, but cheaper and more prolonged. Amphetamines are called uppers, speed, crack, crystal, ice, shabu, glass, and of course all of these are different types of amphetamines. Amphetamines can be snorted or they can be injected. They can also be ingested orally. Worldwide, 33 million people used amphetamines and methamphetamines in 2003. Speed used to come in several forms: amphetamines, crosstops, white crosses, and cartwheels. Biphetamine is black beauties, and the nickname is black beauties. Dexedrine are known as dexies or beans. Benzedrine is known as bennies, and then there is methadone. Once upon a time, I was married to a lady that left me, and she went to work in a truck stop. And while she was working in that truck stop, she started pushing speed to the truck drivers. This is back in the 70s. Well, the police they had started figuring out what was going on, so they were after her. So in order for her to get away, I was in service at the time down in Texas, and she was up in Indiana. She jumped on a bus and came down to Lubbock because she wanted a reconciliation. As it turned out, she was running away from the cops, but she came down there with about 3 or 4 pounds of marijuana and a whole bag of white crosses. That's what she was pushing on the truck drivers. Of course, being in the military, I couldn't have that stuff around, so I threw it away. Of course, she said, "You just threw away $10,000 worth of this." Anyway, okay. And she stayed around for a couple months, and then she took off again, so that was fun. Amphetamines were first synthesized in 1887. It was used by both sides during World War II. It was used as a diet pill in the 1950s and 1960s. The hippies fueled their psychedelic experience with street speed, marijuana, and LSD. Amphetamines became a Schedule II drug in 1970, and that's one of the reasons why the police cared that my ex-wife was pushing drugs, because it became a Schedule II drug in 1970. This was, I don't know, 73, 74, I guess. Street chemists began producing crank, methamphetamine sulfate, and crystal methamphetamine hydrochloride. in 1980s and 1990s. These chemists were able to convert the active chemicals in cold medications, phenylpropanolamine and ephedrine and pseudoephedrine, into crank and crystal. In the 1990s, a new stronger methamphetamine began to be produced called ice glass batu or shabu, dextroisomer methamphetamine. This form later came to be known as crystal meth, tina, peanut butter, deadhead, chalk, tweak, yellow rock, glass, or rose quartz speed. You'll hear me talking about tweaking from time to time. This is what I'm talking about, using crystal meth and having a reaction to it. The profile of typical methamphetamine user is white male between the age of 19 and 40. In the West, and especially Hawaii, an equal number of women have used the drugs as men. Meth is particularly rampant in the gay community, where it is the third most popular drug after alcohol and marijuana. Amphetamines can be cooked in laboratory facilities. Initially, biker gangs cooked the drugs, especially Hells Angels and the Gypsy Jokers. Recently, Mexican gangs have taken over the manufacture. Most of the Hells Angels and Gypsy Jokers that started all this drug trade are dead. Hells Angels still exist, Gypsy Jokers still exist, but the people that use their own product are now gone. Recently, DEA estimates that there are over 300 ways to manufacture methamphetamine from pseudoephedrine, and for this reason, cold medicine has been controlled and put behind the counter. Snorting methamphetamine is more toxic to the nasal mucosa than snorting cocaine and may cause irritation and pain. The most intense high comes from injecting amphetamines directly into the bloodstream. Sclerosis and pain often result from the injection. Methamphetamine is extremely bitter and takes much longer to get the effect to the brain. Amphetamines last 4 to 6 hours as compared to 10 to 90 minutes for cocaine. Amphetamines force the increase of the neurotransmitters norepinephrine, epinephrine, and dopamine because it forces the release of these neurotransmitters from terminal vesicles. It reverses the reabsorption pumps, forcing more neurotransmitters into the synapse. Enzymes that metabolize the neurotransmitters are blocked by amphetamines. Prolonged use of amphetamines reduce the body's ability to produce the affected neurotransmitters. Research shows norepinephrine reduction is as long as 6 months after drug use has ceased. Research also shows a 24% reduction of dopamine, resulting in difficulty feeling pleasure. Thus, after heavy use, for the individual to feel normal, they have to use the drug. Methamphetamine also causes a degeneration of serotonin-producing cells. Research of methamphetamine users found that they had an 11.3% reduction in the gray matter of their hippocampus, their cingulate gyrus, and their paralimbic cortices. And I don't know if you remember this, but hippocampus is where all your memory takes place. These areas affect craving, mood, emotions, and memory. Of course, that's the hippocampus. However, brains on methamphetamines are actually larger due to swelling of the area, trying to protect itself. Amphetamines cause increased energy, increased heart rate, raised blood temperature, rapid respiration, higher blood pressure, dilation of bronchial vessels, appetite suppression. Binging on amphetamines can result in not sleeping for 3 to 10 days. Tolerance of amphetamine is fairly rapid and extreme. A normal dosage is 15 to 30 milligrams. Long-term users may use as much as 5,000 milligrams a day. Effects on these individuals, sleep deprivation, of course, heart toxicity, blood vessel toxicity, severe malnutrition. Overdose may result in convulsions, hyperthermia, cardiovascular collapse. Unlike most drugs, amphetamines are abused as much or more by women than men. This may lead to use during pregnancy, which results in irritable baby syndrome, intolerance to light and touch, tremors, muscle coordination problems, abnormal reflexes, sucking and swallowing problems, disturbed sleep. Other problems that might occur for the baby born to a methamphetamine user is premature delivery, congenital deformities such as clubfoot or limb abnormalities, gastric problems, intestines protruding into the stomach, placental separation and hemorrhage being potentially lethal to both mother and baby, intrauterine brain hemorrhage and stroke, HIV, hepatitis B, and hepatitis C. If the baby survives gestation, they may have developmental problems, growth and developmental delays, learning disabilities, increased incidence of ADHD, increased risks for rage disorder, greater incidence of SIDS. Disability rates range around 33%. Once upon a time, I was teaching in Oklahoma City. I was teaching junior high school. And one of my students was one of the first crack babies in Oklahoma City. Quite an honor to have him in my class, of course. He had ADHD really bad. And I'm not really sure why they had him in the normal population, because he was destructive. He was not a very good kid. Anyway, so one day he decided to steal his brother's pistol. His brother had a 25 caliber automatic. I don't know where in the world he ever found the ammunition for that thing. Not very common. Anyways, a 25 caliber automatic. It had 11 shots in it, or it had a clip with 11 shots in it. And so he brought it to school, and he used to eat. I used to let him eat lunch in my office or in my classroom because nobody wanted him around, and even the teachers didn't want this kid around. So, but I'd let him eat lunch in my classroom, and so he came to lunch every day. They had kicked him off the playground right at the beginning of the year. I guess they did this every year. Every year they tried to make it so that he could actually function in the classroom, and it didn't work. So they let him play on the playground until he did something stupid, and then they would ban him from the playground. But he didn't have any place to go, so I let him in my classroom. Anyway, so this one day he brings the pistol to school. Of course, nobody found it, nobody saw it, and so this the last period of the day I didn't have a class, and so he knocks on my door, and I open my door, and there he is, and he's got a pistol, and it's pointing right against my chest. Now, normally people don't pull a gun on me like that. It was quite a surprise. Anyway, so he's standing there, and he pulls the trigger, and it clicks, and so he tried to clear the chamber, and about that time the basketball coach came walking by, saw the gun, grabbed it out. He was like 7 feet tall. He grabs over this kid. He grabs the gun, he pulls up, and he breaks this kid's finger. You could hear it pop. It's really kind of nasty. And so then the police came, of course. Anyway, what had happened was that everybody hated this kid, even the other kids. So during the day, he had pulled the thing out, and he was distributing bullets to everybody. He was giving them to people so that they'd be nice to him, or they would like him, as weird as that is. And then he would jam the clip back in the gun, and then he would release it, and he'd pull another bullet out and give it to somebody. Well, what he had done, he had jammed it up in there, the clip into the gun so many times that it had pushed the bullet that was actually in the chamber, it pushed it in there sideways. And so when he pulled the trigger, it actually did try to fire, but the bullet was jammed in there, and it wouldn't fire. And when he tried to clear it, of course, he potentially could have cleared that one, but there weren't any more bullets in the gun. That was the last bullet in the gun. And of course, he had the weirdest smile on his face the whole time he's pulling the trigger on me. Of course, they kicked him out of school. This was like his 5th school. He was only in the 6th grade. His mother was a stripper downtown. Anyway, I didn't get killed. They were finding bullets all over that school for weeks. Amphetamines produce mild, intense euphoria, alertness, sexual feelings, sense of well-being, and confidence. After prolonged use, irritability, paranoia, anxiety, aggression, mental confusion, poor judgment, impaired memory, and hallucinations. Now, this kid had never used amphetamines. It was his mom that was a crackhead, of course, but he had lots and lots of problems. Since amphetamines cause an abundance of neurotransmitters that mimic sexual gratification, using the drug becomes a substitute for sexual activity. Amphetamines will also produce violence in people prone to violence because the drug causes people to be suspicious, paranoid, and overconfident. This proclivity for violence among meth users can lead to child abuse and neglect. In Oregon in 2004, 1,850 meth labs were busted, and a full 80% of the child abuse and neglect cases involved meth users. Excessive amphetamine usage can lead to amphetamine psychosis, just as with cocaine. Hallucinations, loss of contact with reality, speech patterns that are indistinguishable from paranoid schizophrenia. Since these symptoms are caused by excess dopamine released by the drug, psychotic episodes can be induced at fairly low doses in individuals prone to excess dopamine. In other words, if the individual already has a proclivity for schizophrenia, the amphetamines will kick them into a psychotic episode. Some individuals may have immediate psychosis, while others may use for years with no problem. Crystal meth seems to have the strongest effect on the brain chemistry, and since it has fewer cardiovascular effects, can be smoked in larger quantities. The result is more severe paranoia, hallucinations, hypervigilant thinking, suicidal depression, addictive use. And that is the end of what we're going to talk about today. We will we'll finish this chapter next week. So stay safe, and I will talk